Hello, my name is Jeremiah Mills, and I want to share with y'all tonight about some interesting information, and it's going to be about different translations of the Bible as far as the Septuagint goes, which is the Greek Old Testament, and about the Textus Receptus, which is the Hebrew and Greek that would be in your interlinear Bible. So right here, this one right here would be your interlinear Bible with J.P. Green, and one of the only people who stood up for it was Dean John Burgeon and a few other people. When Westcott and Hort started, they made their own eclectic text, which means they just took out different lines out of all these different manuscripts, and then they said theirs was the oldest and best. But Dean John Burgeon and J.P. Green writes an introduction in this one by Dean John Burgeon. It's called Unholy Hands on the Bible. And then the interlinear Bible is by J.P. Green, and they're some of the defenders of the Textus Receptus. Now, I'm going to set these on the ground, excuse me. All right, so the reason why this is important is because people want to change the Word of God, don't they? Especially, I mean, they've always wanted to, so there's nothing new under the sun. This right here says the Septuagint with Apocrypha. Now, this is the Greek Old Testament that was written under the Ptolemies, which in the prophetic timeline of Daniel would be, it goes Babylon, Persia, Greece. When Greece took over, the kingdom was divided under 4 generals. And those 4 generals were known as like Ptolemy and this Seleucid, I believe was his name. And then there was a couple of others, and that was when before Rome came on the scene and absorbed those empires. So Textus Receptus. Now, the Old Testament Hebrew isn't really argued about today with the scholarship that goes on in our time. Most people would just completely reject this and say, okay, well, we don't believe this, throw it in the garbage. That's how people feel about Scripture today in general, the New Testament as well. They feel that way about the New Testament. But the Hebrew, why did they choose the Hebrew? I accidentally wrote Old Hebrew, sorry. I meant to write Old Testament right there. So we'll just pretend like I wrote Testament there, okay? So the Old Testament Hebrew, why didn't they put the Septuagint there? Why didn't they put the Septuagint right here in there instead of the Masoretic text, the one that Moses wrote? Well, we're going to explain a little bit about that from the commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud in Hebraica. We're going to comment a little bit about that. Because John Lightfoot, in that book I just showed you, he explains that the Jews didn't want the Gentiles, heathens, the Greeks, to have the real Scriptures in their hands. They wanted to try to keep them as far from having the Old Testament Hebrew as possible. So when we talk about the Textus Receptus, what will come to mind today is the Westcott, and Hort. And if you look in this book, Unholy Hands on the Bible right here, they'll explain to you that they were involved with Mariology in the Guild of Ghosts. And if you read in here a little bit, Unholy Hands on the Bible by Dean John Burgeon, you can learn a little bit more about that. So, but what I'm explaining right here is the Textus Receptus deals with the New Testament. Here, I'm going to erase Westcott and Hort. The Textus Receptus deals with the New Testament. the New Testament. Now, what they group with that in the Old Testament is the Masoretic text, or the Moses, the one that the Old Testament Hebrew. So the Westcott and Hort published the revised. I believe it's called the Revised Standard Version, but I'm going to say the revised text right now. So they went through and they made their own Greek text. Not their own English text, their own Greek text. And that's where a lot of the new translations come from, and that's why you always have people that are in an argument between the Textus Receptus and the Westcott and Hort. Now, that's the New Testament Greek that argument is over. Both pretty much would commonly accept the Old Testament, but with modern day scholarship, they just don't even believe the Bible at all. And we could attribute a lot of that to German materialism and naturalism in the way that they were searching, rather than looking at the scriptures as inspired by God, they looked at the scriptures as a fancy word, isagogics. They study these manuscripts for the age, so they'll do like carbon dating, right? They'll do like carbon dating, and they'll compare texts, and they're looking for an autograph. Now, nobody has a text that was signed by Paul. Nobody has a text that was signed by James. No one has a text that says written by Moses on it, right? So what they do is they say, because you can't find that, it's discredited. And the logic, and what we're talking about right now would be higher criticism. They call it textual criticism. So we'll put textual here. Textual criticism. And that breaks down into two categories: the higher criticism and lower criticism. Now, the lower criticism deals more with the words and scribal errors and things like that, while the higher criticism deals with the dates and the manuscripts and looking for autographed copies. Now, what J.P. Green explains in the introduction of Unholy Hands on the Bible by Dean John Burgeon is he explains that older isn't better. Now, if you understand what we're saying here, it's talking about the scrolls. Now, if you have a scroll that's made out of papyrus or papyri, that's not going to last when you're using it every day. It's not the same paper, right? Like, they don't have this paper that will sit here forever, and you turn it, like the cover is falling off of this Bible, right? But the paper is still perfectly intact. It's not falling apart. Like, you can pull on it and tug on it. So it's not going to fall apart. But the papyri would. So that's why they had these. That's why they had these monasteries and these monks, this monkish kind of orders, like where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. They had papyri. So they had to always be making new ones. So when it comes, they say older, what they say is older is better, but J.P. Green says older isn't better, because the old ones were worn out. And when the people say older is better, the only reason the older ones survived is because they threw them away. Like the ones they found in the St. Catherine's Cathedral that was found by Tisseldorf. He found an old scroll in in a place called St. Catherine's Cathedral, and that's one of the biggest finds that there is, but it was in a wastebasket. Half of the pages were burned because they were using it to light fires. And then they say, well, this is the best one. And it's not, because they threw that one away because they knew it was corrupt. So older isn't better. So what happened was, with the Textus Receptus, a guy named Erasmus, if you do these studies, you're going to find Erasmus. He had the New Testament, and what he did was he put the Latin and the Greek side by side, and he put that through I think it was 5 revisions in his lifetime, revisions. And he found the corruptions that had gone into the text, like putting penance, which means you buy your way out, rather than the Greek word for metanoia, which was repent. And repent and penance is 2 different things. Penance means to buy your way out. So Erasmus started making changes, and he put 5 revisions. And the way that was possible, this was in the 1400s. This was in the 1400s, so that would be the 15th century. So in the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire fell, and the people who were refugees, the Byzantine Empire fell, and that's in modern-day Turkey. It was invaded by the Muslims, and what happened was they carried all of those texts with them over into Europe. And Erasmus started getting his hands on some of them, and he began to realize that they had corrupted the Latin translation, which is the Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholics, and eventually, if you know your history, all of the bishops that were scattered around, like in the New Testament, were absorbed into Rome, because Roman Catholics are just an ancient Roman heresy. It has nothing to do with the things that were happening in Jerusalem in Israel. Alright, so we just covered a lot of information, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to shift gears, and we're going to go into understanding a little bit about the Jews and their history. So if you look in Matthew 5:17, he says, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled." One jot or one tittle. So if you have the Hebrew B, I can't remember exactly how it goes, sorry about that. So if you have a Hebrew B, this is what they call a tittle right here, this little part that hangs off. So if you erase that, it looks like a calf. It looks like a kaf, and that right there might be a jot, right? And so a yod is like this, a yod, so that would be a jot, a yod, in the Tetragrammaton, Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey, Yahweh. This is Yod, that's the first Y in the name. And then, like I said, right there, on the bet, that would be a tittle right there. And if you erase it, it changes it and looks like a kaf. If you take out the yod, that would completely change the word, right? So that's what he's saying right there. So he goes on to say, he says, "Whosoever therefore shall break," and we're in verse 19, Matthew 5, verse 19, "Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men, so he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. So we're going to call this right here, we're going to call this the missing link. Because very few people, unless you study deeply, know anything about this. So the missing link. And it's very sad that more people don't know about this because it's so crucially important to your understanding of the Scriptures. So I'm getting another Sharpie. That one's not showing up very well. So the very next phrase, after he says, ye have heard that it have been said, or so he says, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. He says, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time. So, when he says them, he's talking about the Pharisees. The Pharisees and the scribes. Okay, so what's he talking about there? And then, if you notice, he goes on to say it. And we're going to look at this in verse 521. He says, by them of old time. And then again in verse 27, he says, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time. He's still talking about the Pharisees and the scribes. And then in 531, it hath been said, so he's still saying by them of old time. And then in 533, again, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time. Again in 38, ye have heard that it hath been said, and he's still saying by them of old time. And then in 43, ye have heard that it hath been said. So he's still talking about the scribes and the Pharisees in all of this dialogue. So, what's he talking about? Okay, I have a book right here by Alfred Edersheim. It's called The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. And it's by Alfred Edersheim. And so why is Jesus saying this over and over again throughout Matthew chapter 5? You have heard that it hath been said. You have heard that it hath been said by them of old time. He's talking about the Pharisees and the scribes the whole time. And this is the missing link. Remember that. Hardly anybody knows about this at all. So right here we're going to explain it. We're going to explain it. In fact, one moment, and I'm going to come right back to this Edersheim. I'm going to start out by reading to you a segment out of the commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud and Hebraica by John Lightfoot. And it's an entry that's by R. Layard Harris. And R. Layard Harris is who helped put together the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. And it's a 2-volume set. And he's the one who's speaking here in the foreword to John Lightfoot. And he says, there are probably 2 dangers in Talmud study. So what's the Talmud? The Talmud is what Jesus is referring to. That belongs to the scribes and Pharisees. And we'll say by implication too, the Sadducees. Scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees, Israel. This was their law in that time, the Talmud. The Talmud is the commentaries on, this is their commentaries on Torah. Not the Torah, but their commentaries. These guys wrote their own writings. Now, to make that concrete in our day, that's like taking John MacArthur's study Bible. John MacArthur, his study Bible, and he says, "You buy this. Come to Grace Community Church or Grace to You Church, and buy my study Bible." Or R.C. Sproul. R.C. Sproul. These highly respected men of our time. R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur, Chuck Missler, buy my books that I've written. And then you take those guys and you start reading them like these guys did with the old rabbis. Rabbis. Why do you think there's this big gripe going on in the scripture between all of those guys and Jesus? Jesus Christ is Yahweh incarnate. So who do you think knows the truth when they're having these arguments over authority, which is exactly what it was? The Pharisees and the Sadducees say, we're in charge. And Jesus says, you're not in charge. I'm in charge. I'm Yahweh incarnate. What are you talking about? Y'all have completely forsaken the Torah, and y'all are preaching these written commentaries on the Talmud. Okay, so in all honesty, so you understand, the Talmud hadn't been written yet, but they already had this from back when in 722 BC and in 586 BC, they had been carried off. This is when northern Israel, northern Israel, and southern Israel, I'll put SI for southern Israel, were carried away. And northern Israel was carried away by Assyria in 722 BC. And then southern Israel was carried away by Babylon in 586 BC. So when they got carried away, well, northern Israel, they hated them because they intermingled with the Assyrians. So southern Israel, which is Judah, is called Judah. Northern Israel is called Ephraim, Samaria, and it's called Joseph. Sometimes northern Israel is called Joseph. Joseph, you know Joseph. It'll be called Israel. It'll be called Samaria, and it'll be called Ephraim. Northern Israel will be called all those things. Write that down if you don't know. It's Joseph, Israel, Samaria, and Ephraim. Now, southern Israel is usually called Judah. It's usually called Judah. It might be called a couple of other things as well. I just can't think of it right now. And they were carried away by Babylon. And when they got carried away, they invented the synagogue. And the synagogue never had a patent on it. And that's where the rabbis come from. Rabbis. Rabbis, plural, is actually rabbin. So rabbin. That's where the rabbin come from. And Jesus says, call no man rabbi, which interpreted as master. He says, call no man master upon the earth. So when they were carried away, in northern Israel had 3 deportations into Assyria. And then southern Israel had 3 deportations into Babylon. And you can find that if you look in the book of Jeremiah in the Kill and Delete commentary. Now it says right here, there are probably 2 dangers in Talmud study. The one of underemphasis, the other of exaggeration. The Talmud is a compilation of Jewish tradition. The Talmud is a compilation of Jewish tradition. From where? The rabbin in the synagogues when they were carried away captive in those deportations I just told you about. From early medieval times. Doubtless a part of this tradition is valid. The question is, which part? In form, the Talmud is an interpretation and application of the Mishnah. So the Talmud is an interpretation and application of the Mishnah. These are just Jewish writings of the Pentateuch. Application of the Mishnah and the Mishnah of the Pentateuch. Because it's their own writings, like the John MacArthur R.C. Sproul Bible, the rabbins, R.C. Sproul, right? The rabbi of their times who would be equivalent to John MacArthur, R.C. Sproul, or you name it. Joel Osteen in his books, right? So it says, after the close of the Old Testament canon, when Jews were conscious that prophecy had ceased, leaders of Jewish thought were faced with questions of ethics and practice that demanded new applications of the law. These precedents were discussed by generations of scholars called Tanaim. T-A-N-N-A-I-M. Tanaim. The scholars. And their deliberations became a body of traditional opinion. Why do you think Jesus says over and over again about their tradition, washing their hands, these ritual washings? Like the water baptism, where'd that come from, right? Well, study and learn about it. It was a Jewish tradition that had came to take place of the Levitical washing at the temple. And the scripture says now we're baptized by the Spirit. It says it's traditional opinions. The scriptures are of no private opinion, it says in the book of Peter. No private interpretation. So it says, in about AD 200, these oral traditions were written down in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah was never even written down, and those oral traditions go all the way back to the carrying away, 722 BC, 586 BC. And they didn't even write it down until 200 AD. Have you ever played the game of telephone? You know, you whisper in one person's ear like a sentence, telephone, and then by the time it gets to the last person, it's a whole different story. Well, what do you think they wrote down in 200 AD when they wrote this Mishnah? A 1,000-year-old game of telephone, right? It's insane. And this is what the Jewish synagogues till this day follow. The Jewish synagogues this day. You go outside, you drive down the street, you see a Jewish synagogue. This is what they follow. Now, it says, were written down in the Mishnah in 6 divisions called orders. So, the Mishnah was written down in 6 divisions. 6 divisions called orders. 6 divisions called orders, comprising 63 chapters. 63 chapters. And they're called tractates. 63 chapters called tractates. These were written in a late dialect of Hebrew called Mishnaic Hebrew. So this is a later dialect of Hebrew called Mishnaic Hebrew. So I'm going to go ahead and erase that. I'll erase all this. As time went on, more discussion gave rise to more precedents, and these discussions of later generations of scholars called Amorim, these later generations of scholars were called Amoraim, and the ones before were called Tanaim. So Tanaim were the first scholars, and the later ones were called Amoraim, were written down in Aramaic. Aramaic. So now it's no longer the Mishnaic Hebrew. Mishnaic Hebrew. Now they speak a new language, Aramaic. Because they've been carried away captive, there's new people around, so now they're speaking new languages. That's what happens when you get absorbed into a universal empire like Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, America. Now the whole world's trying to speak English, right? Because America and British have teamed up and taken over the entire world through their banking system and democracy, right? So, let me see. So these guys were the Mishnaic Hebrew up here, right? The Tanaim. And then the Amoraim are the Aramaic right there. And it says, these Aramaic chapters are called Gemara. Gemara. were appended to the paragraphs of the Mishnah. So they added these Gemara, these Aramaic footnotes, or it says, so these Aramaic chapters, Gemara, were appended to the chapters of the Mishnah. Those writings, those 6 divisions we talked about with the 63 chapters called tractates. And this is all opinion. It's traditional opinion. There's some truth sprinkled in there, of course, but you have to dig through it, just like any book, really. You have to watch what they're saying. We're appended to the paragraphs of the Mishnah, so the Talmud has a paragraph of Hebrew followed by Aramaic commentary. So the Talmud has a paragraph of Hebrew followed by Aramaic commentary. So it would be the Mishnaic Hebrew followed by the Gemara of the Aramaic commentary that was put there. It was written down around AD 500 in 2 recensions, the Palestinian of Jerusalem Talmud and the longer and more widely used Babylonian Talmud. So these weren't even written down. So the first part, was written down in AD 200. It was known as the Mishnah. The second part was written down in AD 500, and it was called, and that's when all of this was combined into the Talmud. And there was 2 of them. There's the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud. And that's the one that's more used right here, the Babylonian one. And we can also, from that, we can get into a lot of the conflation of that confusion and secretiveness of like the Masonic lodges and things like that, and how the Masonic lodges are taken from the same idea of how the Jews tried to guard the Hebrew from the Gentiles, which would any other nation besides the Jews they called heathen. So they tried to guard it from the Babylonian people, the Persian people, the Grecian people, the Roman people, and they'll give them a different writing, like the Septuagint, and so they can't get in there and actually understand the nuances of truth. So he says, it will be observed that the Jews did not begin to write down these traditions until AD 200, a big game of telephone. And the Talmud was not completed until 500 AD, a colossal game of telephone. The Talmudic manuscripts that survive the medieval burnings of Jewish books are few and come from the late Middle Ages. Therefore, they should be used with some caution in interpreting the New Testament. The New Testament histories were written down within one lifetime of the death of Christ. Most of them within about 40 years. The majority of Pauline epistles, at least, are admitted to be genuine and therefore were written before the 60s by a man who knew Jerusalem and Jewish thought very well. We have extensive portions of the New Testament and copies made around 200. It is very precarious, therefore, to use these late Jewish traditions to bring into question early Christian accounts written by eyewitnesses like Matthew and John. On the other hand, such early Jewish customs and institutions as these Jewish documents reflect may frequently furnish a background against which the New Testament can be more fully understood, like we just discussed in Matthew chapter 5. Lightfoot has used these documents judiciously. He has also used extensively the work of the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote around AD 90. The work of this older scholar is worth our close attention. Josephus says that Jesus came, and I could show that to you. I think I have shown it before, but you can open Josephus's work, and he talks about Jesus being the Messiah. Now back to Edersheim. I told you I was going to go back here to Edersheim. Now he explains here some of the same information And he explains, but Palestine owed, if possible, a still greater debt to Babylonian. And you can see this, how the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, and how they would come to choose the Babylonian Talmud as a greater. The new circumstances in which the Jews were placed on their return seemed to render necessary an adaptation of the Mosaic law, if not new legislation. Besides, piety and zeal now attach themselves to the outward observance and study of the letter of the law. This is the origin of the Mishnah, our second law, which was intended to explain the supplement the first. So they had the Mishnah as the second law to supplement the first. So they call the Mishnah the second law. Mishnah. And this is the rabbin synagogue inventions here. Second law. To furnish the first. The Talmud, right? This constituted the only Jewish dogmatics in the real sense, in the study of which the sage, rabbi, scholar, scribe, and darshan were engaged. The result of it was the Midrash. Midrash, or investigation. Midrash means investigation. Investigation. Sorry if I spelled that wrong. I'm kind of running out of time here. A term which afterwards was popularly applied to the commentaries on the scriptures and preaching. From the outset, Jewish theology divided into two branches. And here you go, this is important. Halakhah and Halakhah and Haggadah. Halakhah, H-A-L-A-K-H-A-H. Haggadah, H-A-G-G-A-D-A-H. The former, from halak, to go, was, so to speak, the rule of the spiritual road, and when fixed, had even greater authority than the scriptures of the Old Testament, since it explained and applied them. On the other hand, the Haggadah, from Nagad, to tell, was only the personal saying of the teacher, more or less valuable according to his learning and popularity, or the authorities which he could quote in his support. Exactly what we're saying, like the comparison to R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur, Greg Laurie, Joel Osteen, Billy Graham, all their writings, whether they're popular or not, right? So it says, and these are what then eventually became the Talmud, which was the Midrash and the Mishnah there. And so it's explaining that the Halakhah was the spiritual road when it was fixed. And it had greater authority than the scriptures. They put this stuff before Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. They said Talmud is more important. Can you believe that? Can you believe they would do that? What do you think Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 5 there, when he's getting on to the Pharisees and scribes? You have heard that it hath been said by them of old. So Talmud, in their eyes, even though it wasn't called the Talmud yet, it was still the Mishnah, the Midrash, the Halakhah, Haggadah. They said Talmud is more important than Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Jesus, the Messiah, came and set the record straight. He says, no, erase that. He says, get that out of here, right? They said it was more important than the Old Testament. Again, I had to say that again. And then the Haggadah was the opinions of the rabbis and the scribes. Well, so was the Halakhah, but the Haggadah was just well, these are pretty much opinions. They're saying, well, the Haggadah is like opinions, and if it was Billy Graham, they're like, whoa, that's important. Or if it's John MacArthur, like, oh, you better listen to what he has to say. He's an important guy, right? So they would stand back like that. It was only the personal saying of the teacher, talking about the Haggadah. So more or less valuable according to his learning and popularity are the authorities which he could quote in his support. So you quote the authorities, right? I'm quoting authorities, some of the people they would consider authorities right now, but I'm quoting information that's important out of it. I'm trying not to quote their own opinions. So, unlike the Halakhah, the Haggadah had no absolute authority, either as to doctrine, practice, or exegesis, but all the greater would be its popular influence, and all the more dangerous the doctrinal license which it allowed. In fact, strange as it may sound, almost all the doctrinal teaching of the synagogue is to be derived from the Haggadah, the opinions of the rabbis. And this also is characteristic of Jewish traditionalism. Go down the street, you see a synagogue, they're still teaching this. But alike in Halakhah and Haggadah, Palestine was under the deepest obligation to Babylonia, for the father of halakhic study was Hillel, that's where the Pharisees came out of, the Babylonian. And among the popular Haggadists, there is not a name better known than that of Eleazar the Mede, who flourished in the 1st century of our era. So, Hillel and Eleazar the Mede, those are a few of the rabbis that were so important to him. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information, and y'all's brains are probably about to burst. So I'm just going to name this video Talmud, Midrash, Mishnah, Halakhah, Haggadah, Gemara, and there's still many more things you would have to learn about that wicked institution of the synagogue with the rabbis and all of that who were teaching these things, the Halakhah and the Haggadah, above the truth of the Old Testament canon, what Moses got from God, and Jesus says, I am. So Jesus was the one who gave Moses the law in the Old Testament. That's what Emmanuel means, is God with us. So when Jesus came, he set the record straight. He said, forget about all those traditions. That's silliness. Get out of there and leave those guys alone, because they're lying. It's lies. And just like we explained a couple videos ago, the Jews brought their traditions with them, and then they said, well, we're Christians, but what do they call that? We're Messianic Jews, right? And then they're teaching all those things. Messianic Jews still believe in that Halakhah, Haggadah, Talmud, Mishnah, Midrash, Targum, all of those things. And we'll go more into these things if God allows us. And just like they said, the bishop, the deacon, and the priest was just a shadow of the high priest, and the priests, just like what they were doing in the temple. And then so the same thing with the Gentiles. The Gentiles weren't just going to let go of their gods, like the Roman gods, the Grecian gods, the Persian gods, like Zoroaster and the Persians, or the Babylonian Marduk and Baal. They weren't just going to let all those things go when Christianity came around. So it's important for us to understand how we got to this system that's in place today called the church, because the church is not the ecclesia. The ecclesia is not the same as the church. The church was a word borrowed by pagan missionaries. Pagan, foreign people, pagan missionaries. And then once this thing took over, this institution, they just call whatever they write This is ecclesiastical. They call it ecclesiastical. Ecclesiastical. Sorry, I ran out of room. But it's not ecclesiastical because it has nothing to do with the ecclesia. The ecclesia are the called out. They're called out. The people who are claimed by God by election from the foundation of the world. They've been predestinate. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he be the firstborn among many brethren. So, okay guys, this is a lot of information. I know my head's about to explode, so I'm guessing that it's pretty rough for people out there, especially if you've never heard this information. So, just one more note, and I'm going to let you go. The Septuagint, often called the LXX, was the Greek language written for the Ptolemies in Egypt of the Old Testament. Now, what I want to share with you eventually is an entry from another one of my books here, from the John Lightfoot. I was reading from one of these earlier, the commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud in Hebraica, and just kind of explain to you how the Jews didn't want the truth of the Hebrew put into the hands of the Greek speakers, and just kind of show you what he writes about that. But don't get me wrong, the Septuagint is an important book as well. It helps us know a lot that we probably wouldn't otherwise know if it hadn't been written. So the Septuagint is an important piece of history. So, all right, thanks for watching, y'all. Bye.